Welcome to Muslims and Mental Health with Sister Heather, a groundbreaking program looking at mental health issues through the biopsychosocial spiritual paradigm.
Welcome to another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Today we'll be starting a 3-part series discussing the psychology of aging. We'll be looking at normal aging, pathological aging, and health and wellness around the issue of aging. Joining me today will be Dr. Cris Scaglione, who is a professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology of Southern California. She is trained in clinical psychology with a specialization in neuropsychology, and she has worked with elder adults for more than 20 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cris Scaglione to the program. Welcome, Dr. Scaglione.
Glad to be here.
So today we're going to start the first part of this series with normal aging process and looking at the brain and the developmental aspects of aging. So I want to start out by asking you, what is the difference between, or what are the 4 concepts of aging? When we think about aging, like the biocycle, we like to look at our programming through the biopsychosocial spiritual paradigm.
Good.
And so along those lines, how do you conceptualize age?
Well, aging is conceived at least along those lines. Mostly today, I think we'll be talking about the developmental aspect, which encompasses biological aging, that is basically the person's state of health, as in contrast to the chronological aging, which is simply the passage of time. Psychological aging refers to a person's cognitive capacities, adaptive capacities, personality, that sort of thing, as well as a social conceptualization of aging, which has to do with interpersonal relationships and one's roles and how they change through time, as well as expectations about social functioning and connectedness through the lifespan.
Mm-hmm. And so who is Erickson, and why is he important in understanding the lifespan?
Eric Erickson. He's a developmental psychologist. He was trained as a psychoanalyst, and through his many years of experience, recognized that people tend to have developmental tasks at certain phases of their life. Unlike earlier models of psychodynamic development, he has a psychosocial model that also continues through the lifespan, doesn't stop at adolescence or early adulthood. He has, of his 8 phases, he has at least 3 of them that address functioning from middle age through older age. Mm-hmm. And despite the fact that this was clinically derived, it actually turns out that even through research and cross-cultural research, these stages actually do hold up pretty well. Mm-hmm. Through middle adulthood, people are seeking a very solid sense of connectedness with usually a partner and family. As they get a little older, their focus tends to be on leaving something behind for possibly a legacy. Mm-hmm. We call that stage generativity. And the final stages of one's life tends to focus on looking at one's life in retrospect and seeing if it holds together, if it's coherent and meaningful, and making adjustments if necessary.
And so, moving on from that, what is selective optimization and compensation theory?
I call it SOC theory, SOC. This is a theory that has many applications, including in industrial and organizational psychology. It is largely a developmental theory that looks at development throughout the lifespan, but it has particular utility when you think about older adults. Mm-hmm. Selectivity essentially means prioritizing what's important to you and focusing your attention and your efforts and your resources on those activities or career aspirations or family aspirations or relationship aspirations that are important to you. Mm-hmm. Optimization refers to seeing how things are going, making adjustments so that things go as well as possible in those areas that you have selected as important. Compensation is more relevant to us as we get older, because it refers to changing gears, changing priorities, changing how you allocate resources as resources either change or losses occur in your life, losses of health, losses of relationship, loss of dignity because you no longer have a job. If I could make a brain analogy, these are somewhat like the skills that we call executive skills. So that's decision making and problem solving would be selectivity. The optimization would be the monitoring and minor adjustments made in order to ensure that things go as planned. The compensatory phases would be shifting and cognitive flexibility that is required as resources and other things change. Those would be good frontal lobe skills. The problem with that is that as we get older, sometimes frontal lobe skills tend to fall off.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And so, just to round them out, then what is this socio-emotional selectivity theory?
Completely different set of research here, but it does fit rather well with the SOC theory, with the selectivity, optimization, and compensation, which is much easier to say SOC. This is work through Stanford University and the researchers associated with Carstensen. What they've noticed is that as we develop and we begin to realize that our time is in fact limited, that we're not going to live forever, priorities change. This occurs also in people that have terminal illnesses or in some ways feel as though their life is going to be foreshortened. Priorities will shift, and they consistently shift towards making choices that are emotionally satisfying, that are socially gratifying, and that are positive. We call this a positivity effect. I'm noticing this. Not only have I worked with older folks, but I'm now not quite 65. I've just turned 60. And I'm noticing that I don't feel like wasting my time on things that don't bring me some degree of satisfaction. It's kind of like I've been there, done that. I don't need to deal with this anymore. Part of the result of this is that people tend to narrow their social focus and focus also on activities that bring them pleasure as opposed to those things that are a total hassle, as an example.
You know, it seems like we've seen this shift as well in our culture, right? Because we, especially with the baby boomer generation, we see them doing this a lot more than maybe previous generations did, where they are actually engaging in activities rather than doing the traditional grandparent activities. Generally speaking, they are doing more than that. They're pursuing their own interests, and we didn't see that before.
Not as much, and it's partly because the baby boomer generation is quite large and actually is influencing our culture greatly. But also there are more options available to them. We are less agrarian. We are less tied to seasons. We are less tied, in some ways, in good ways, and in some ways, in unfortunate ways, less tied to family. So that there are more options, and we can talk a little bit about that later. It turns out to be fairly healthy for older adults.
Yeah, I just brought that up with you mentioning that. So before we go on, I want to go into cognition and aging, but before we do that, I just want to ask you briefly, what do you see a utility to knowing these theories? I mean, why are these theories important?
In psychology, the term theory is used a little bit more loosely, I think, than many people think of it. It tends to mean more of an approach of a particular perspective on an issue. It is a theory in the sense that it does, in fact, describe and predict a phenomenon, but it doesn't have hard and fast rules. These are more, as you hear the term theory in these discussions, you might want to think more of a perspective or an approach. So,
is it really more of a way of organizing?
Yeah, it would be. And it organizes information. It delimits what it is that you're going to observe. It allows you to eventually start making predictions about how things would go. There are some rules, but they're not hard and fast. It's not like predicting. Well, actually, you know, in some way, I just realized it is similar to physics. When you get to complex phenomena, you can't, in fact, predict things. It's too complicated, as opposed to other theories that allow you to say, if I do this, that's going to happen. In psychology, the phenomena are much more complex. And so a theory doesn't necessarily say, if this, then that, with certainty.
That's
That was
really good
that
to
was sort
know.
of in a tangent, but
Yeah, but I think that it's really good to know because I think that when people understand theory as if this then that, they may totally miss the boat about what we do.
right.
And the point of psychotherapy and the point of, that it's not all, if you put an A, you get B.
Right. So understanding these things from various perspectives gives us as therapists more tools to use, more ways of explaining something to someone in a way that they might understand. I think it's important, our training, especially as clinical psychologists, we get various perspectives. There are experimental, developmental, pathologically oriented, etc. And all of them are going to be important at some point, more relevant or more salient at some point. And it's a pool of knowledge to draw from and bring into the room as it's helpful to do so.
Thank you for clarifying that. So, moving on, I want to ask you to explain to us what is cognition and aging.
There are various approaches that people take to looking at cognition and aging, and it's important because you want to know what is normal aging, and then what is starting to look like pathological cognitive processes that suggest that you have a dementing process. That is not normal aging. A lot of people assume that the end stage of aging is dementia and decline. Decline is inevitable, but dementia may not be. So it's important to understand what is normal about age-related changes and what is not. There's many sources of evidence, but there's a fairly solid sense that what is normal about aging, and by the way, cognition for your audience just means thinking processes. What is normal about aging is that mainly things slow down. And that can account for a lot of the changes that are seen in testing. It's really just the slowing down of cognitive processes. So we'll get to the answer, but a little bit slower. It is shown that the implicit knowledge and semantic knowledge, these are things that are either processes that we sort of know by heart, as well as strategies, are pretty intact. So we may be a little slower, but we're a little more wily, potentially. Other cognitive changes that are normal as we get older is that actually drawing gets a little worse. And as we get really old, you'll notice the writing on a page will slant upward. That's normal. It's like by the time you hit your 80s and 90s, your writing is almost always slanting upward. So maybe an art class now and again would help. Other changes that are pretty normal, of course, involve sensory changes, diminishment of vision. I see great from my hand on out, but between here and there, it's pretty blurry. And that's normal. It is normal also to have hearing loss, particularly, unfortunately, right at the conversational range, the higher pitches. So you might have to speak more slowly, a little more loudly. Don't assume that somebody's deaf and yell at them. Those are typical changes. The types of memory issues that we think about that are normal for aging would be just having trouble finding the right word. I have it particularly badly for people's names. I just rack my brain sometimes for very familiar names. That's actually fairly normal. Maybe not to the level I have it, but...
I might be in trouble because I already have that
Oh,
problem.
really? Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, wait till you hit your 60s. Whoa. So those are, I know that there's other sorts of things that are fairly normal. Those are the ones I can think of offhand.
Okay. Okay, so great. I want to continue with some more questions for you, but at this time I need to take a break for our sponsors. So we'll take a break and we'll be right back.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Welcome back to Muslims and Mental Health. Today we're discussing the psychology of aging with Dr. Scaglione. Okay, we're going to continue now, and I want to move on and ask you about sensory, perception, and memory changes that occur as we age.
Right. So we're still sticking though with normal ages,
Normal
aging
aging,
processes, right? I can't add too much more than what I had previously said. What does occur though is because processing is a bit slower, and sensation and perception are lessened, they can combine to make a person look more impaired than they actually are. And there's a phenomenon that's called de-differentiation, which refers to the fact that as we get older, our thinking processes are less differentiated from our perceptual processes. The thing is, our thinking processes are never differentiated from our perceptual processes, but since both of them are slowing down or being slightly impaired, it looks as though perception is more heavily influencing the thinking. In fact, changes in hearing and vision actually can predict cognitive functioning at times, and that's normal. If you're in doubt, then send somebody for what we would call a neuropsychological evaluation, and we can talk about that more in a later segment.
So, this makes me wonder, I don't know if this is too optimistic to think this way, but given that things are slowing down and assumingly there's an awareness of that in the normal aging, right? And so are people more deliberate about their actions? I mean, whereas you find younger people are more impulsive, in the aging process you find people are more deliberate, and so in some ways it's better. I mean, it's more focused, it's deliberate,
It can be, and it's a deliberateness that is of necessity. Some of that deliberateness is also motoric. So if for instance, I've broken my ankle, I now need to walk more carefully, which slows me down. But yes, if I'm not seeing as well and hearing as well and thinking a little bit more slowly, I am going to take more time and more effort. And yes, my ultimate output may be more considered, may be more mindful. That actually ties in with some observations of personality in aging, whereby people are sometimes shown to be more conscientious. But I think it's exactly this. I think it's having to slow down and be more considerate in one's responses.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's what I wanted to ask you about next.
Good segue.
What are the theories of personality in aging?
There's no necessarily coherent theory. There's some fairly stable observations. One of the observations is that compared to younger people, as we age, our personality becomes more differentiated. One way of saying that is we become more like ourselves. As we develop, you can feel this.
Would you say more authentic?
It depends on the person. Ideally, yes, more authentic. I think that as people age, for instance, in the 30s, you'll hear people say, I'm sort of coming into myself. That process continues, if that makes sense. It can be more authentic if a person chooses to be. Some interesting things also occur that we don't understand. I have noticed over time that sometimes people who are anxious or kind of irritable and unpleasant actually do mellow out over time. Some people don't, though. Some people who are pretty nice, easygoing, suddenly become more irritable.
Really cantankerous.
Yes. That often, that would be a signal to perhaps look for other cognitive changes. But sometimes it's just a personality shift that does not appear to go with any cognitive impairment. But
I've especially noticed this with women, right? Because of part of it has to do with the social aspect of not being allowed to express yourself in certain ways, but with the aging process, women getting more or feeling freer to they express it that way. I feel freer to actually speak my mind now.
Right.
But it sounds like from what you're saying, it really has more to do with just aging.
Right. Well, but part of aging is, of course, that social aspect of being less concerned with what other people think of you and wanting to live the way you want to live. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that can, in fact, make people a little crankier, partly because they haven't had practice in being assertive. They just, it's either I'm going to be nice and demure, or I'm just going to let loose. That can happen.
Yeah.
If you want to, some other things come to mind. One of the areas of personality research in aging that is the most common is the use of what they call the big 5 personality factors. Normal personality is broken down into 5 main areas: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and what something's called neuroticism, which is basically being anxious and unnecessarily weird about things. Pretty consistently, and despite this cantankerous old lady thing that we were just talking about, agreeableness actually tends to improve. And it's partly because, I think, and we'll go back to some of the other theories, we choose to be in relationships that are more fulfilling and rewarding, and we choose to have interactions that are emotionally satisfying. And so if we have to make compromises here and there, that's fine. I'll just go along with it because I'm tired of the hassle. Many studies also show conscientiousness increases, and that might also be due to, again, wanting to do things right, but it could also have a lot to do with this. I have to be more measured in my responses because it takes me a while to assemble things instead of acting quickly.
And so building upon that, the psychosocial theories of aging, we're talking about the social aspect a little bit. Can you speak a little bit to like disengagement theory, activity theory, continuity theory?
Okay. Before I do that, probably the most important thing that is known about development in general, but is really important for aging, is the fact that in our interpersonal interactions and within our inner mental life, meaning and meaningfulness and satisfaction are really, really important. This has come up again repeatedly, but even within the social theories, meaningfulness is so important. And as things are taken away from us, our health, our family members, our job, those sorts of things, meaning still has to be really, really important. There's some qualities also of what we call personality or interpersonal functioning that are also associated with healthy brains. So the more neurotic someone is, the more anxious and picky and critical someone is, those are actually a risk factor possibly for later cognitive decline. There's less gray matter, and there's also associated with more cardiovascular disease, partly because you're always going, at least figuratively. And oddly enough, extroversion and conscientiousness often predict longevity, which is too bad because I'm an introvert. Oh well. However, my life is full of meaning, so I might make it. But some of the psychosocial aspects of aging, you mentioned the disengagement theory. That's sort of associated with pathological aging. It's assumed by this idea that both society and the older person choose to disengage from each other. That sounds like a sort of a neglect or rejection. And if that's happening, the person might be quite ill, frail, or possibly depressed. That is not necessarily a normal thing. This disengagement is not that selectively choosing to be with certain people. It's a general withdrawal from the world. It might be normal for, say, end of life, but is not normal for the aging process. And it speaks to perhaps a society that does not value older adults. The continuity theory sort of is more of a normal aging aspect, and that is, as we age, we do try to keep up with activities, interests, social circles, again, with the caveat being if we still enjoy them, and if they're still emotionally satisfying and positive.
So it's not to the extent of I'm going to defy my aging process,
right?
Which is what we see in a lot of Hollywood, right?
Right. Or some people will choose to do that, which is just not smart. Part of aging well is accepting the good, the bad, and the ugly that goes with it, and adapting to it. There can be unhealthy continuity. I'm still going to play rugby. Well, not for long. The activity theory, it sort of goes along with what you're saying, and that is, it turns out that healthy, happy, older adults remain fairly active, and they may take on new activities, and even if the person hasn't been particularly active during their life, if they start something new, something that's not terribly strenuous, it's actually really good for them. And this refers to any kind of activity, but particularly physical activity and social activity. Teams, dancing. Dancing's great for older adults because it has that social and physical component to it. So those are the main psychosocial ones I think that you mentioned.
Okay, and so is there anything else you wanted to cover around developmental aspect of aging that we haven't already covered thus far in this episode?
I think I will probably repeat this later, but I think it's very important to emphasize that throughout the developmental arc, there's two sometimes opposing. This is where the action always is in that duality, that yin-yang, the two opposing factors. One is the development of autonomy and identity and mastery on the one hand, while also maintaining affiliation and connectedness, meaningful and positive affiliation. And if those two things are very important for anyone, and it's particularly important for the older adult, to maintain some level of autonomy while also remaining connected with people. That would be, if there was any takeaway, if that could be remembered, that would be helpful.
Great. So I want to transition. We like to ask our interviewees fun questions at the end of episodes. And so I'm going to ask you a few at the end of each episode.
Okay.
And so in this one, I want to ask you, who is your hero if you have one, and why?
Well, I have a lot of heroes, actually. I read a lot, and I read a lot of science. So a lot of my heroes are forward-thinking people. Probably right now in my life, though, as I age, more and more of my heroes are women. As I see that women's rights and women's needs continually are neglected, in parallel with the needs of children and of the ecology and nature. So many of my heroes now are more of the eco-warriors. Very early on, Rachel Carson warned us that insecticides were killing us off, and she was right. People who try to protect, I was a primatologist before I went into psychology. People who protect, say, the gorillas, Dian Fossey, and the chimps with Sue Rumbaugh. So right now, those are the people that come to mind.
Oh, that's great. And what is your favorite concept and why?
Ooh. How about time travel? If I could take my 60-year-old brain and put it back in my 25-year-old body, that would be perfect.
Yeah, that would be great. And what is your favorite word and why?
Ooh, favorite word. That probably changes daily. I'll say yes. That's my favorite word.
And why is that?
Because it is opportunity, it is possibility, it is not shutting down.
That's great. Very optimistic.
Not bad for an old gal.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us and your knowledge around the normal developmental aging process. And of course, we're going to see you back for a couple more episodes. But today, this concludes this episode of Muslims and Mental Health. As always, we appreciate your comments, your feedback, your concerns, and you can reach us at nafshealertherapy@gmail.com. That's NAFSHEALERTHERAPY HEALER therapy@gmail.com. And please also look at our adjunctive website at nefshealertherapy.wordpress.com. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.